Imagine it's March 2007. You're a 44-year-old electrical engineer named David living in a suburb outside Phoenix, Arizona. You have a mortgage on a house that has doubled in value since you bought it. You have a 401k, a savings account, and a stock portfolio you've been building for 11 years. But you've been watching, you've been reading, you've been doing the homework that nobody around you bothered to do. You've seen the loan documents circulating in your neighborhood, mortgages given to people with no income, no jobs, no assets. You've read the research on subprime default rates. You've done the math, and the math doesn't work. So you act. You sell your stock portfolio in April 2007. You move everything to cash. You read Peter Schiff's book, Crash Proof, and you move $80,000 into foreign stocks and commodities because Schiff's thesis is airtight. The dollar is going to collapse when America's debt bubble pops. You tell your wife you've protected the family. You sleep better than you have in years. Then 2008 arrives, and everything you prepared for happens exactly as you predicted. And you still lose. This is not a story about being wrong. David was right about almost everything. The housing market did collapse. The banks were insolvent. The debt bubble did pop. He saw it before 97% of Wall Street's highest paid professionals. This is a story about something more uncomfortable than being wrong. This is a story about what happens when you are completely, precisely, documentedly correct and still end up on the losing side. This pattern did not begin in 2008, and it did not end there. It has played out in every major financial crisis in modern history, and it will play out in the next one. Because the paradox isn't about the specific assets people chose or the specific crisis they prepared for. The paradox is structural. It is a trap built into the architecture of preparation itself. And once you understand the mechanism, you begin to see something unsettling about every piece of advice circulating right now about how to protect yourself from what's coming next. Failure 1. The diagnosis-treatment gap. In early 2008, Peter Schiff was the most famous correct person in America. He had gone on CNBC in 2006 and told a panel of laughing analysts that real estate would collapse, banks would fail, and the American consumer was living on borrowed time. He was mocked on television. Clips of those interviews circulated afterward as evidence of institutional blindness. His clients, the ones who had trusted his correct diagnosis, moved their money into foreign stocks, specifically European and emerging market equities. The thesis was airtight. When the American debt bubble explodes, investors will flee the dollar weakens. Foreign assets priced in stronger currencies outperform. What actually happened was the opposite. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, global banks didn't flee the dollar. They ran to it. Every institution on earth needed US dollars to cover their dollar-denominated debts. The dollar surged. Foreign stocks collapsed in local currency terms and then collapsed again in dollar terms as the currencies weakened simultaneously. Schiff's clients lost 40 to 70%. A man named Brian Kohlberg had put $70,000 into Schiff's strategy specifically to protect himself. By January 2009, it was worth $25,000. He had trusted the one man who was publicly, visibly, documentably correct about the crisis and lost 64% anyway. His neighbor, who had done nothing, who had ignored all the warnings, lost 51% at the bottom and recovered everything by 2013. David's money never fully came back. The diagnosis was perfect, the treatment was wrong, and you cannot separate them in advance. Failure 2, the timing trap. In 2005, a physician named Michael Burry read thousands of pages of mortgage loan documents that no one else on Wall Street had bothered to read. He found loans issued to people with no income, no jobs, no assets, loans that would default the moment interest rates reset. He created a financial instrument that would pay out when those loans failed. He put his entire fund into this bet. He was right. He personally made $100 million. His investors made $725 million. It is the most famous correct prediction in financial history. But here's the part the film shows you and the legend omits. Between 2005 and 2007, while Burry held his positions and the market kept rising, his investors were paying premiums every month for insurance on a collapse that hadn't arrived yet. They wrote him hostile letters. One investor flew to his office and screamed at him for 20 minutes. Others threatened lawsuits. Several forced partial redemptions, meaning they withdrew their money before the payoff, and missed the entire gain they had correctly funded. Burry had to lock his own investors in against their will. He suspended redemptions, legally preventing people from accessing their money. Because if they left, the positions collapsed and everyone lost. The people who trusted the right man at the right time with the right thesis forced their way out because being right took too long. They prepared correctly. They funded the correct prediction. They still lost. John Maynard Keynes wrote this sentence in 1936. Markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing the specific mechanism by which correct preparation destroys the people practicing it. Failure 3. The correlation trap. Gold is the oldest store of value in human civilization. It has 5,000 years of documented history as a hedge against currency collapse. Every financial crisis in the last century has eventually vindicated gold holders. The thesis is not speculation. The thesis is metallurgy and history. In March 2008, gold hit $1,000 per ounce for the first time in history. Bear Stearns was collapsing. The crisis was visibly accelerating. Gold was doing precisely what gold was supposed to do. Then, Lehman failed on September 15th. And on that day, the single most catastrophic day in modern financial history, the day the global system came closest to total collapse, gold fell to its annual low of $692, a 30% decline from its peak. The safe haven collapsed at the exact moment it was needed most. The reason is mechanical. When Lehman fell, banks needed cash, specifically US dollars, within hours. They sold everything that could be sold. Gold positions were liquidated to meet margin calls, the very property that makes gold valuable in a slow collapse. Its independence from the financial system provided no protection in a fast liquidity seizure because everyone was selling everything simultaneously. In a genuine systemic crisis, correlations go to 1.0. Every asset falls together because every institution is selling everything at once. The people who prepared with gold watched their safe haven fall 30% during the worst weeks of the crisis. If they panicked and sold at $692, a rational response when every other asset is simultaneously crashing, they locked in a loss on the asset they had bought specifically to avoid losses. Gold eventually recovered. It hit $1,900 in 2011, but only for investors who had the financial stability to hold through a 30% drawdown first. The preparation required resources. The preparation itself had consumed. Failure 4, the psychology trap. This is the one nobody discusses because it is the most humiliating. The S&P 500 fell 57% from its October 2007 peak to its March 2009 low of 66. The people who had moved to cash in 2007, who had correctly predicted the crash, correctly protected their capital, correctly survived the collapse, were now sitting on cash with the market at 666. This was the moment. This was what the preparation was for. Almost none of them bought. The headlines in March 2009 were not screaming buy. They were screaming unemployment at 10%, housing still falling, banks still insolvent. The psychological reality of having I just survived a 57% crash is not clarity, it is terror. The preparation had validated the fear. The evidence said the fear was correct. How do you override a year of being proven right and force yourself to buy at the bottom? The S&P went from 666 in March 2009 to 1,115 by December 2009, a 67% gain in 9 months. By 2013, it had fully recovered all 2008 losses. By 2020, it had tripled from the 2009 low. Studies of investor behavior show that people who moved to cash after the initial decline in 2008 have still not fully recovered their losses. Not because the market didn't recover, but because they watched the entire recovery from the sidelines, psychologically unable to re-enter. The preparation that saved them from the crash made them incapable of surviving the recovery. Both happened to the same people at the same time. Failure 5. The rule change trap. Every preparation strategy is built on historical rules. In 1929, the government let the banks fail. Prices deflated by 30%. The people with cash could buy real assets at depression prices. Every preparation model built between 1930 and 2007 included some version of this scenario. The prudent survive. The reckless are wiped out. The system resets. This was the historical pattern. The Federal Reserve created $4 trillion out of nothing and used it to buy the toxic assets from the banks that had created the crisis. This had never been done at this scale in peacetime. There was no historical model for it. No preparation framework included it. The effect was systematic and specific in who it punished. Zero interest rates for 7 years meant that cash, the safe preparation, earned nothing while inflation quietly eroded it. Housing, which the prepared had expected to fall further, was reflated by cheap money and began rising again by 2012. The stock market, which the prepared had correctly exited, tripled from its bottom powered by QE. A saver who held $100,000 in cash from 2009 to 2019 had roughly $700 in nominal terms, and perhaps $85,000 in real purchasing power. His irresponsible neighbor, who ignored all the warnings and stayed invested, was sitting on $300,000. The government rewrote the rules mid-game, not secretly, not illegally, openly in press conferences with stated justifications. The people who prepared for the game that had been played in 1929 and 1937 and 1973 were playing a game that no longer existed. Their preparation was not wrong. The rules they prepared for were simply replaced. The pattern. Step back from the 5 individual failure mechanisms and look at what they share. Schiff's clients, Burry's investors, the gold holders, the cash savers, the deflation preppers, they all prepared. They all made rational decisions based on available evidence. They all correctly identified that something was wrong with the system. And every single one of them encountered a version of the same trap. The system does not fail in the way you prepared for. It fails in the way that specifically defeats your preparation. This is not coincidence, it is structural. The system is complex enough that a correct diagnosis of its vulnerability does not produce a correct prediction of its failure mode. And the failure mode is precisely the thing your preparation cannot anticipate. Because if it were anticipatable, it would already be priced in. The German middle class of 1923 trusted their institutions and gave their gold away voluntarily before the crisis arrived. The Argentine middle class of 2001 held dollar deposits because they trusted the peg, and the government forcibly converted those dollars to pesos at a rate that stole 75% of their value. In Lebanon in 2019, depositors held dollar accounts because the dollar was the safe haven, and the banks simply blocked access. Every preparation strategy that became mainstream became the specific thing the crisis destroyed. What the survivors actually did. The documented record from every collapse shows the same pattern among survivors. They did not find the one correct asset. They maintained multiple options simultaneously, some of which failed and some of which survived, so the failures did not take everything. They held preparation lightly enough to adapt when the mechanism proved different than expected. They did not bet everything on one thesis, however correct that thesis appeared. And critically, they did not prepare for the crash at the expense of preparing for the recovery. The crash is one event. The recovery is the decade that follows. Both require completely different postures. Preparation that optimizes only for surviving the fall has no resources left for climbing back up. Now, step back further. The U.S. federal debt exceeded $36 trillion in early 2025. Annual interest payments on that debt have surpassed $1 trillion, or exceeding the defense budget for the first time in American history. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from $900 billion in 2008 to $9 trillion at its 2022 peak. M2 money supply jumped 25% in 2020 alone, the largest single-year expansion in American history. Central banks globally purchased more than 1,000 tons of gold in 2022 and 2023, and again in 2024. 3 consecutive years at double the prior decade's average. These are not the actions of institutions that are confident in what comes next. These are the actions of institutions hedging against scenarios they are not discussing publicly. The same institutions that dismissed every warning in 2006 are quietly buying exactly what the dismissed people told them to buy. The preparation paradox will operate again. The 5 traps, the diagnosis-treatment gap, the timing trap, the correlation trap, the psychology trap, the rule change trap, are not specific to 2008. They are specific to human psychology under financial stress. They activate whenever a person prepares correctly for a crisis and then encounters a crisis that arrives differently than expected. David, the engineer from Phoenix, is still alive. He is still employed. His family is housed. But the $80,000 he moved into Schiff's strategy to protect them became $29,000. The house he could have bought at the bottom of the crash in 2011 instead appreciated 80% before he felt safe enough to buy. The recovery he had correctly predicted would follow the crash. He watched it from the outside, unable to force himself back in. He prepared. He was right. He still lost. The question is not whether you should prepare. The question is whether the preparation you're building right now accounts for the 5 ways correct preparation becomes the mechanism of loss. The historical record is specific on this point. The people who came through were not the ones who found the right asset. They were the ones who understood that the crisis would defeat their preparation, and prepared for that too. The pattern is already in motion somewhere. This channel doesn't tell you what to buy. It shows you what actually happened to the people who already decided, so that the pattern becomes visible before it becomes personal.